All right. Hello, everyone. We have an incredible crowd already here. I am super excited that you are joining us this evening. This is Left Bank Books and Tennessee Williams Festival of St. Louis welcomes St. Louis author Henry Schvey, who will discuss his new biography of Tennessee Williams, Blue Song, St. Louis in the Life and Work of Tennessee Williams. Schvey will be in conversation tonight with St. Louis's esteemed former journalist, Robert Duffy. Left Bank Books is St. Louis's oldest independent bookstore. We would like to thank all of our supporters, the supporters of Henry and Robert, and everyone for their outpouring of love for our bookstore. We offer curbside pickup and delivery to anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world even. We are now open to customers coming into the store, so you can find this incredible book on our front table, also on, I believe, 3 different displays, maybe 2, I can't remember. But it's a little bit all over the store, so you are sure to find this when you come in to shop. We believe that events are a way to expand your mind and bring in new thoughts to make the world a better place. We hope that you enjoyed this event, and we hope that you support Left Bank Books by purchasing a signed copy for you or for your friends at left-bank.com. Henry was so nice to come in and actually sign copies. So we have live signed copies in the store right now, but he will also come back if you would like to have a personalized copy. So if you want this book signed to you or to someone else, then Henry will come in and sign that copy and we can get it in the mail or have it ready for pickup. Purchasing a copy of the book from Left Bank Books allows us to keep our bookstore and staff operating, and it allows us to keep this event series going. So thank you for your support. I am Shane Mullen. I'm the events coordinator for Left Bank Books. I help produce our hundreds of author events each year with a fantastic team here in St. Louis. We will be taking questions from you, the audience, at the end of the event. So you can type your questions as a comment at any point in time, and we will get to that towards the end of the hour. And be sure to follow Left Bank Books on Facebook and YouTube to be notified about all of our fantastic virtual events. We are almost done with June. We have one more event next week, but July is packed with fantastic events for readers of all ages. And now about tonight's book, Blue Song, St. Louis and the Life and Work of Tennessee Williams. In 2011, the centennial of Tennessee Williams' birth events were held around the world, honoring America's greatest playwright. There were festivals, conferences, and exhibitions held in places closely associated with Williams' life and career. New Orleans held major celebrations, as did New York, Key West, and Provincetown. But absolutely nothing was done to celebrate Williams' life and extraordinary literary and theatrical career in the place where he lived in longest and called home longer than any other, St. Louis, Missouri. The question of this paradox lies at the heart of this book, an attempt not so much to correct the record about Williams' well-chronicled dislike of the city, but rather to reveal how the city was absolutely indispensable to his formation and development both as a person and artist. Unlike the prevailing scholarly narrative that suggests that Williams discovered himself artistically and sexually in the Deep South and New Orleans, Blue Song reveals that Williams remained emotionally tethered to St. Louis for a host of reasons for the rest of his life. John Guare, the playwright and screenwriter, author of The House of Blue Leaves and 6 Degrees of Separation, says, "When Tennessee Williams was asked what brought him to New Orleans, he said, St. Louis." In this eminently readable and exhaustively researched study, Henry Schvey deftly swivels the spotlight, illuminating the work of Tennessee Williams from the freedom of New Orleans, which is typically heralded as the source of his greatness, and shines it boldly back into the prison of Tennessee's life in St. Pollution, which enshrouded him with a darkness he was never able to escape. A notable contribution to the understanding of this great, ever fascinating American playwright. And Carrie Hook, I forgot to ask how her name is pronounced, the executive director of the Tennessee Williams Festival St. Louis, says, "Blue Song delves deeply and insightfully into St. Louis's complicated influence on Williams' life and work. A fantastic read." And now about tonight's speakers. Henry Schvey is professor of drama and comparative literature at Washington University in St. Louis and the author of 3 books, including Oscar Kokoschka, The Painter as Playwright. He lives in St. Louis, Missouri. And tonight, Henry will be in conversation with Robert Duffy. Robert reported on arts and culture for St. Louis Public Radio. He had a 32-year career at the Post-Dispatch, then helped to found the St. Louis Beacon, which merged in January with St. Louis Public Radio. He has written about the visual arts, music, architecture, and urban design throughout his career. And now, without further ado, if you would please help me in warmly welcoming it to the screen, Henry Schvey and Robert Duffy. Hello.
Hello. Thank you, Jane.
We have a humongous crowd here this evening. Someone is already chiming in that they are visiting us from Amsterdam for the night's event. So I'm glad they did not have to make a plane trip to see this, and happy to have everyone here. Really looking forward to this conversation.
That is so gratifying. Welcome to all. This is going to be a discussion that's aimed directly at Blue Song, a book about one of St. Louis's most brilliant, cantankerous, and ambivalent native sons, Tennessee Williams. The book is subtitled St. Louis and the Life and Work of Tennessee Williams, and in subtitle there is a sharp preview of what this book reveals so brilliantly and thoroughly. I'm Robert Duffy. I worked at the Post-Dispatch for 32 years and have spent 40 years in all as a journalist. And my most recent work is a appreciation of Blue Song in the June issue of St. Louis Magazine. Henry Schvey, the author, is a memoirist and critic, and also a prolific writer and producer of drama at Washington University. In general, beyond St. Louis and even in the current population, the popular imagination associates the life and work of Tennessee Williams with New Orleans and the Mississippi Delta, not the Midwest and St. Louis. He is, after all, Tennessee Williams, and he was born in Columbus, Mississippi, eventually moving on to St. Louis. As he matured, he became vocal in his distaste for the city and its population, which he regarded as hopelessly culturally Neanderthalish and snobbish. Henry, this new book, Blue Song, seems to flip the script on how scholars and the wider public should consider Williams. First of all, how extensive were his connections to St. Louis? And if they were extensive, why didn't he embrace them?
Well, let me answer that. And in some ways, that is the story. That's the drama of the book. Because first of all, I want to welcome everybody and thank Shane Mullen for the kind words, and you, Bobby, for your appreciation of this book. It's not really a surprise to me that there are people on hand from Amsterdam or from the Netherlands, because the story of this book actually began in Holland. I began my teaching career at Leiden University in the Netherlands, and my first attempts at theatrical direction took place also in Holland. And one of those early plays was The Glass Menagerie. And so for that production, I did extensive research into Tennessee Williams and St. Louis, and of course, investigated the relationship, the complicated relationship between them. But I got nowhere close to where I got until one of my good friends, Cecile Verburg, visited from the Netherlands, and she asked me, she had designed the costumes for the Glass Menagerie, and she asked me, where can I get a book about Tennessee Williams' relationship to St. Louis? I said, well, I'll get right back to you. I don't know the answer to that. And I checked and checked and checked, and I found that there was no such book. There were some very illuminating essays, but no book systematically detailing the importance of St. Louis on Williams' life. So that's the genesis of this book. That's how the drama started. Now, For those of you that aren't aware, Williams, of course, was born in 1911, as Bob Duffy mentioned, in Columbus, Mississippi. The family moved to St. Louis in 1918. So he was 7 years old when he moved to St. Louis, and it was life-changing. His early years were spent in the rectory of his grandparents' home, and as far as Williams was concerned, they were idyllic. Whether they were as idyllic as he claims is another matter, perhaps, but he felt that they were very beautiful, and he romanticized them. St. Louis, on the other hand, as the book indicates, was a highly polluted Midwestern city. It was called Shoe City. It was the shoe manufacturing capital of the entire world. And the reason that they settled in St. Louis was because Tennessee's father, of course, he wasn't Tennessee then, he was Thomas Lanier Williams. Tennessee's father was transferred to the International Shoe Company as a manager. And their lives suddenly changed. They went from rural Mississippi to an urban metropolis. And that really changed everything in terms of Williams' outlook. He was, as has been suggested already in this discussion, unhappy here. He was ridiculed during his early years for his accent, his Southern accent, and he felt really at odds with everything about the new city. And of course, this was prompted to a large extent by his own mother, Edwina. He was very close with his mother, and his mother felt a strong antipathy to St. Louis. Although Edwina was born in Ohio, she considered herself a kind of Southern belle, and she paraded herself as a Southern belle. And those of you that know the Glass Menagerie realize how she is characterized. I won't use the word caricatured, but characterized in the Glass Menagerie as Amanda Wingfield. But Edwina prompted her children, both Rose, his elder sister, and Tom, with a very strong dislike about St. Louis. So in terms of the answer to Bob's question here, Williams lived in St. Louis from 1918, and he called it his home really between 1918 and 1938, making it the place he lived longest in his entire life. So in terms of why he didn't appreciate St. Louis, the book explains at some length why. A lot of it had to do with his mother, and his mother very strongly accused the St. Louis upper classes of being snooty and snobby. The Williamses were never happy here, Edwina in particular. They moved 9 different times during the time in which Tom lived in St. Louis, always a little bit westward. Each move took them westward until she could claim with pride that they were now beyond the city limits of St. Louis and that they had moved into Clayton. So his whole life here, in some ways, was an attempt to avoid St. Louis and to escape it. It's not for nothing that Williams' own motto was en avant, going forward. He really wanted to go forward from St. Louis to the wider world. And he finally did, of course, escape in 1938 when he went to St. Louis. But as the book indicates, is to say that he escaped St. Louis for New Orleans or Tangier or Provincetown or New York City or Broadway or any other place is really facile thinking, because as I try to show, Williams really never escaped this city. It stayed with him and it was in his bones. He came back here forcibly in 1969, where he was interned at Barnes Hospital in the Renard wing of Barnes Hospital. And of course, as many of you will know, he's actually buried here in Calvary Cemetery. But for years, people have thought about that burial as being strangely inappropriate. My book actually claims that it is very apposite, and that Williams really, in some ways, is claimed by the city. So the book chronicles a controversial relationship between a city which he openly despised and a great, great artist. So that gets us started. I don't want this to turn into a simple monologue. Bobby, I hope that begins to answer some of what your question raised.
Yeah, it was indeed. Did his time here actually have influence on the work, and in what ways was it? Is it exhibited in the work?
St. Louis had tremendous influence on Williams' work in all sorts of ways. I would claim that in two particular areas it did. One was he became a playwright in St. Louis. He became attached to a community theater company called the Mummers, and Williams' earliest plays, which have long been branded as specimens of juvenilia, were done here in St. Louis. In fact, I don't consider them juvenilia at all. I consider them mature works, apprentice works perhaps, but works which show a fully fledged talent for writing. So he had the opportunity here in St. Louis to write experimental plays. And those plays he wrote in rapid succession. Stairs to the Roof was written slightly afterwards, but plays like Candles to the Sun, Fugitive Kind, Not About Nightingales, Spring Storm were all about the world in which he lived in St. Louis. So as a practical matter, Williams, in his apprenticeship to the Mummers, became a playwright here in St. Louis. In a more, I would say in a more in-depth way, he not only became a playwright here, he became an artist here. I'm trying to create a subtle distinction between the two. His two best friends at Washington University formed a poetry club with Williams. And there he really explored what it meant to become an artist. He was able, in short, to convert his outsider sense of what it meant to be alienated from the world of St. Louis into a kind of way of a coping mechanism. Williams was a compulsive writer. There is no more autobiographical writer than Williams, nor is there a more obsessive writer than Williams. We have plays that have begun as short stories and poems and constantly, almost obsessively rewritten during the entire period of his life. And he learned that technique here in St. Louis, specifically at Washington University, where he was only a student for 1 year, a matriculating student during 1 year in 1936-37, and then angrily left after finishing with honorable mention in a playwriting contest, a one-act playwriting contest here in St. Louis. So I would say that Williams absorbed the lessons. He also, and I think that this may also be something that helps to answer what you just said, Bobby, he benefited from the kind of urban sophistication of St. Louis, even though he never acknowledged it. He did acknowledge the importance of the Mummers, but he also benefited from a superior educational system that St. Louis was known for. His work in junior high school and high school was extraordinary. He started writing poetry at Ben Blewett Junior High, what we would call middle school today. And in high school, he started writing a series of travel columns. So his work is not only emotionally tethered to St. Louis, but his training came in St. Louis in a way that it would never have come had he remained, say, a citizen of Columbus or Clarksdale Mississippi. So the urban world was not only polluted and unpleasant to him, but it also gave him a first-class education.
I'm interested in the geography of Williams and St. Louis and landmarks we can sort of point to as having influence. And certainly the Glass Menagerie is one that's well known, but there's another one that was given prominence, and that is the apotheosis of St. Louis on Art Hill. And you have something to read about that influence. Is that right?
Yes. It comes from a very early story called Oriflamme, and it deals with a female character, who is clearly a kind of alter ego to the playwright himself, or perhaps it is a combination of Tom and his sister Rose, whom I think we should come back to also, because that is naturally one of the crucial connections with the city. But in this short story, Oriflamme, he describes a young girl who has been sick for a number of weeks, and she leaves. She's feeling a little bit better, and she goes for a walk, but it's less a walk than an act of liberation and renunciation. And she leaves and she buys a red dress and she puts the dress on and she feels totally freed. Having worked in the basement of famous bar, she is now a free woman. And she walks through Forest Park and she ends up finding herself in Forest Park near Art Hill. And I'll just read a short excerpt from this paragraph of this early story called Oriflamme. She had become a little disoriented. Before her stood a gigantic equestrian statue. Her chin just reached the top of the granite pediment. There were the hooves on the level with her eyes. It looked as though the horse was about to step on her. Her eyes traveled upward to study the towering figure. All green it had turned with an ancient, mossy greenness. It bore a shield and elevated a sword. The look was fierce and compelling. Who was this stranger, this menacing giant on horseback? Her eyes descended to gaze at the inscription. St. Louis. It said, "Ah, yes, the name of the city." No wonder she felt so breathless. She had climbed to the highest point in the park, and now if she turned to look in the other direction, all of the city named for this ruthless horseman would stretch underneath. To the east as far as the river. She would not turn. The city had never pleased her. The terrible horseman over the heads of people was image enough of what she felt in the city. Her hope had died in a basement in the city. Her faith had died in one of its smug churches. Her love had not survived the journey across it. She would not turn to face the sprawling city. Instead, she would move across to that public fountain, no longer swiftly. What am I dragging behind me? 28 years and all those institutions. So what she has seen, what this young girl has seen, of course, is the equestrian statue of Saint Louis, Louis IX, above on Art Hill. But when the character talks about imprisonment or all those institutions, he's talking both about his sister Rose and himself. And I think we can see in the personification of the equestrian statue of Saint Louis what Williams really felt in his heart of hearts about the city itself.
That's fascinating, and I've never heard that before, but it's certainly very, very compelling and very telling about his connections with St. Louis. And you've touched on this several times, but why do you think that the connection should be fundamental to the ways that we now understand the work of this man, America's greatest greatest playwright?
Well, I think that it could all simply be dismissed as biographical fluff were it not for the most important aspect in studying Williams' work, and that is he had one subject, basically, and that subject was himself and his family.
Yeah.
And that subject never changed. It's there in his adolescent writings, it's there in his young adulthood, and it's there in old age. And he was constantly writing from first to last about his family, about his smothering mother, about his bullying, tyrannical father, and most importantly, about his sister Rose, who was, of course, a tragic figure. They were considered the couple in Clarksdale. She was 2 years older, and Williams felt that she taught him everything. And then, unfortunately, of course, she fell prey to mental illness. And during the time in which Williams was at Washington University in 36, 37, she became institutionalized. At the very hospital first, Barnes Hospital, where Williams was institutionalized some 30 years later in 1969. And his writing about his family, above all else, is what preoccupied him. And so even in works written 40 years later, he is still writing about, in the two-character play written in the late 70s, he's also writing about he and his sister. In almost every work that in his very last play, A House Not Meant to Stand, he's writing about his bullying, homophobic father and his smothering, ineffectual mother. So these tropes never left him. And that's why we need to understand the emotional world in which he came of age. It's not simply extrinsic, it's intrinsic. Now, I would be the last person to dismiss the importance of New Orleans. I've written about it, and I think that New Orleans is what liberated Williams, and he needed that, and he was searching for it his entire life, for the kind of freedom that New Orleans, and specifically the French Quarter, the bohemian world of New Orleans, gave him. And he knew it immediately. On his first visit to New Orleans, he knew in 3 hours that this is the place I was meant for. But the place that we have been born in, or the place that we grow up in, remains an essential part of our lives. And in Williams' case, his entire oeuvre was based upon revolt, upon discarding the bourgeois, the conservative, the smugness that he found in St. Louis, or that his mother told him was associated with St. Louis, and finding that bohemian rebellion. But the entire work is based of this contradiction in terms. That is, on one hand, there's the grist he was fighting against, and then there was the thing he was moving toward. And you can't simply have one without the other. And so it's a kind of Blakean dichotomy, that it's not possible to move forward without contradiction. And Williams, I think, was always a character in his personal life who was trying to resolve these two. He was born into a kind of puritanical world in which sex was something that you avoided completely talking about. His mother was that way. And his father, in some ways, was the exact opposite. And so the sense of contradiction, of frustration, was part of his life. And in my opinion, he never really extricated himself from the world of St. Louis, and specifically longing to somehow connect with his sister. He continued to support him. She outlived him, but he continued to support him long after she became institutionalized. And as many of the people I'm sure in the audience know, was given one of the earliest lobotomies, prefrontal lobotomies, which rendered her essentially incapable of living alone. It was to connect with her. And of course, it's her story that he writes about in The Glass Menagerie, but it's her story that he keeps writing about in stories, in screenplays, in poems, throughout his life. So the idea that he escaped St. Louis is a fatuous one, and I think that that's where this book, in some ways, does attempt to flip the script on the ways in which we look at Tennessee Williams and St. Louis.
So tell me more about his relationship with his mother and how the smothering had affected him throughout his life. The moving around is interesting too, because they did keep moving west, but one thing about her that was rather noble was that she kept moving into good school districts if she possibly could. And that's how he got to Ben Blewett High School. I mean, junior high, that was so important to him.
Yes.
But she was a dreadful person. And I'm sure the older he got, the more he recognized it.
He did. I think that she, just as the character or the portrayal of his mother as Amanda Wingfield is a complicated one, and productions that make her out to be simply silly are incorrect.
Right.
But she was a difficult person. Her nonstop talking, her worshiping of her world as a Southern belle, all of these were important. And I think she bequeathed Williams the gift of, if you like, storytelling. She delighted in simply speaking in language. So she did certainly contribute to his talent. But you're right that the longer he lived, especially with psychoanalysis, he felt that she was really, he referred to her near the end of his life as that little Prussian officer in drag. He was not pleased with the legacy that she gave him. And in fact, he began to forgive his father's brutality and mocking of him. He called Tom Miss Nancy growing up. He was more forgiving about his father's sins than he was about his mother's smothering quality, oddly enough. He felt that his father's sexual frustration were something that he could identify with, where his mother, of course, represented the kind of abstinence, the refusal to acknowledge the animal in man. It was one of the gifts that D.H. Lawrence, the English novelist, gave him, this idea of human beings acting through their instinct. And Edwina Williams was somebody who eschewed instinct. She wanted to literally cut that out of us. And I think that Williams, in some ways, with the references to Rose's lobotomy, and we see this also in a play like Suddenly Last Summer, where Violet Venable wants to have her niece, Catherine, lobotomized. The fear of the truth, the fear of instinct, and the fear of sexuality were the qualities that Williams abhorred and that were connected most closely with his mother and her life. So I think that yes, and you're right, she did help to educate him. She was, in fact, the one who put him in touch with the Mummers, with the community theater group. She was instrumental, but like other forces in our lives, they're both a combination of good and in this sense, ill. And interestingly enough, Edwina never recognized her portrayal in The Glass Menagerie. She said, "It's time we lay that ghost to rest." That Amanda Wingfield was based upon her portrait.
Yeah. The other landmark that I'll mention, and then we'll leave that behind, was the Wednesday Club building at the corner of Taylor and Westminster Place, which was a block away from the apartment. But that was where the first play was produced, I believe, wasn't it? Was that the Mummers?
Yes, it absolutely was. The Candles to the Sun, And it was done at the Wednesday Club auditorium, which the Mummers rented. All of these things are in very close proximity. When the Williams family first moved to St. Louis on that hot July 1918 day, they stayed in a boarding house just minutes from there. And so it was his world in St. Louis blossomed. He wouldn't have called it blossoming, but within this very tiny radius of, and obviously a stone's throw from Left Bank Books.
Right, exactly. Just around the corner, after all.
Yes, absolutely. And that was where he learned his craft, at the Mummers. And he also learned the sense of agonizing familial dysfunction at that same spot. So all of these things, both of these things, were born in the world right in St. Louis, in the Central West End.
Right around him.
Yes.
That brings us back to Left Bank, and Henry and I both appreciate so much your giving us this time on your program, and we've enjoyed putting it together. It's been a great learning process for me, and I am so glad that we were able to come here tonight. I see in the comments section that we have 50 people watching, and that's a great audience. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming, not coming out tonight, but coming tonight. So all the best to all of you, and thank you very much. Henry.
Thank you so much. And I'm delighted. One of the great, I think Bobby and I both suffer from a certain kind of a fear of the technology sometimes, but this is one of the great advantages, to be able to reach so many people not in the immediate vicinity of Left Bank Books, in different cities, different locations, who are able to tune in. And we really want to support Left Bank Books in every way possible, and encourage you, if you are interested in purchasing a copy, that you purchase it from Left Bank. Perfect timing. Signed copies. Okay.
Do we want to switch to audience Q&A a little bit early? We have a lot of questions already here, and I'm certain that there are more questions that the audience has.
Fine with me.
Yes, sure. That's great.
All right. Let's start with a question from Jenny. So Jenny's question: how would you explain the international appeal of Williams, even though he is so quintessentially American?
That's a really interesting question. And I think that the thematics of his book, of his plays and his short stories and his poems as well, which are obviously less well known, connect with human experience. Sexuality and relationship between the sexes. These are some of the quintessential madness, death. These are the basic predicates of Williams' work, and they're things that are present in all great literature. So I think that that while his work is quintessentially American in many respects, it's simply it goes beyond what is American. I think it speaks to all of us. His sense of fear of Williams lived with a fear that he himself would follow his sister into madness. His fear of old age. All of these things are not confined to a specific location or locale. They're human concerns. So I think I have myself have experienced the love of Williams in other countries, where he's in Greece, for example, where Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, or Streetcar Named Desire are welcomed as masterpieces, or the fact that Streetcar was the first American play ever shown at the Comédie Française during 2011. Astonishing facts. And I think there is also something about Williams' locations that speaks to a kind of heat, something that works well in in tropical countries. Many of them are set abroad. So I think that there's a variety of reasons, but I would say the most important is a sort of the passionate aspect of what Williams is dealing with in relationships between human beings. The psyche, I think, is what makes that speak internationally.
Carrie is here from the Tennessee Williams Festival, St. Louis. Hi, Carrie. So Carrie wanted to remind everyone to come hear more on this between August 19th and August 29th at the Tennessee Williams Festival, St. Louis. Henry, you will be there speaking on this the topic more of Tennessee Williams in St. Louis.
Cool.
And there will be play productions as well. And you can find out more about that at twstl.org. And I wanted to ask a question about that. In my introduction, what's surprising to me was that St. Louis was not part of celebrating was it the
centennial of his
centennial. Not sesquicentennial. That's way too long.
Right.
So St. Louis did not celebrate the centennial of Tennessee Williams. And I'm wondering how that process started to get kind of corrected and how St. Louis has been able to celebrate him now as one of their literary heroes.
Well, I think that all tributes are due, or considerably due, to Carrie Houck and her fervent desire to reclaim Tennessee Williams for a St. Louis audience. But I remember the first year of the festival, just sitting as a fly in the performance of Stairs to the Roof, which was the first one that they did at the Bouquet Club, and hearing people talk about, yes, but he didn't like it here, did he? Yes, he lived here, but he didn't like it here. And just that sense of he doesn't quite fit in some ways, oddly enough, echoing Edwina's own concern about St. Louis snobbery. Edwina Williams felt that in St. Louis, you were either born into the purple or not. And it was impossible to change classes. St. Louis, of course, is a place where gated streets came about, talking about neighborhoods. There was a sense of enclosure and a sense of restriction. And I think it was very different for Edwina, who felt as a kind of aristocrat in the tiny town that she was raised in Clarksdale, because she was the rector's beautiful daughter. And she felt excluded here. And I think that it's fair to say that she inculcated that prejudice toward Williams. Sometimes you read Williams quotations about St. Louis, and they echo to the word things that Edwina said earlier. So I think a lot of it was picked up secondhand. And the kids, let's face it, the kids were both, Rose and Tom, were not easy children. They were misfits. They were their own species of fugitive kind. And so Williams was born, as most artists are, an outsider. And I think the juxtaposition between the comforts of Mississippi and the Mississippi Delta and St. Louis acted as a kind of sharpening mechanism, as a crucible for his talent. In Rose's case, obviously, it crushed her. And in Tennessee, Tom Williams' case, it allowed his talent to blossom and to burgeon. He had his, if you like, Rose retreated into a world inside. Tom was able to create a world of different characters and different people. And this you see even in the earliest plays, the ones that Bob Duffy was talking about that were done at the Wednesday Club. Plays of casts of 20 or 30 people, all of the characters are individualized. Now, these are plays that have not been performed. I dare say most people listening now will have never heard of Candles to the Sun or Spring Storm, or Not About Nightingales. but these plays reflect an extraordinary talent, and that this is Williams in his 20s, and as I said before, Williams had a single subject: himself and his family and Rose. That was his subject, and that didn't really change. And he was also introduced to political drama here in St. Louis because of the Depression years. So that was another aspect that is sort of incorporated. It was a kind of apprenticeship here in St. Louis for him as an artist.
A question from a different Jenny. We seem to appreciate him as an artist now. And I would say that, yes, I think that a lot of us here in the room will say that they appreciate him very much. But how was Williams looked at or accepted as an artist during his lifetime?
Well, that's a very revealing comment, and I'll just touch upon it now, but it's something that maybe can be discussed further at the talk at the festival, and it's there in the book. Williams' career was very much a mixed bag. He went from tremendous accolades and really acknowledged and was acknowledged as the great newcomer, and that part of that was the creation of the persona of Tennessee Williams, which we haven't talked about really, but today we talk about publicity and about creating a persona in the media and in the arts, and Williams really sculpted his persona. But in responding to Jenny's question, Williams came out of nowhere with Glass Menagerie and hit the height of fame, deservedly so, with in my opinion, the greatest American play ever written, A Streetcar Named Desire. And after that, not immediately after that, I mean, he continued to write remarkable plays. But by 1961, at the age of about 50, Williams was conceived of as having been written out. Imagine living another 22 years. I mean, he was in early middle age, and his plays started to be panned more regularly, and he himself fell victim to drug and alcohol abuse and also to critical homophobia. And by the 70s, he was essentially forgotten and written off, and turned to painting in Key West. And he still compulsively wrote. When I say turn to painting, I don't mean that he didn't write. It was enough of an addiction for him that he continued to write, but his plays were no longer taken seriously. He was written off as a failure. And so in discussing Williams' career trajectory, you really deal with somebody who ascended to the very heights of fame, and not only fame as an artist, but as a character, as a personality in American lore in the 40s and 50s, and then suffered an unimaginable decline mentally, physically, in every way. And that decline became cataclysmic in 1969 with the horrendous and extremely vituperative reviews of a play that is not well known called In the Bar of a Tokyo Hotel. And Williams was so frightened and so shocked and so disturbed that he ended up in a nervous breakdown, and ended up being hospitalized by his brother at Barnes Hospital. So it was a kind of moving full circle from the greatest heights that any artist could ever reach to the greatest depths. He survived that in 1969 and continued to work. He died in 1983, but he was always, he was never really recognized as a great artist. Or if he was, it was the earlier works that were recognized: Cat on a Hot Tin Roof and Streetcar and Menagerie, rather than more recent works. And his fame basically ended. His last Broadway success was a play that the festival did 2 years ago, beautifully done, Night of the Iguana. And after that Broadway production, 1961, it really continued to fade. And he was never, unlike a playwright, say, like Edward Albee, who lived to see a kind of renaissance of his work with Three Tall Women or The Goat in older years. Williams was considered written out. Now, that is not true. He continued to create important plays, but they weren't Broadway plays, and they weren't plays that were commensurate to Streetcar. So there's that to deal with. I hope I answered Jenny's question, thoroughly enough.
I think so. Yeah. We have two questions that I think are kind of touching on similar things, so I'm going to kind of combine them from Peniel and from Leslie. So Peniel asks, have you found that Williams had any positive, lasting relationships with place or people in St. Louis? And Leslie similarly is asking, was there anything about St. Louis that Williams acknowledged was aesthetic or helpful to him? So basically, did he hate everything?
No, I think that he, first of all, he did, he hated most things, but he didn't hate everything. I think that he acknowledged the fact of having received an education, begrudgingly, but I think that that his experiences in his poetry club with, among others, William J. Smith, his classmate, or Clark Mills, really gave him an appreciation for world literature. An earlier question by the other Jenny was about Williams as a world-class poet. And he learned to read, he read French symbolism, he read avant-garde poetry, he read Joyce, he read Lawrence, he read, of course, Hart Crane, his favorite artist of all. So he was exposed to these things in an academic context. So he appreciated that very, very much. As far as what he didn't appreciate was his family. And obviously family stays the same no matter where we go. So it sort of hooked him in. I think in terms of when he returned to St. Louis in 1976 to speak at Graham Chapel, there was no bitterness in his voice. I've listened to the recordings at the library, and there was no bitterness. In fact, there was an enjoyment. And I think if you want to answer Leslie's question, take a look at one or two of the later plays. Specifically the play A Lovely Sunday for Creve Coeur, which was also performed by the festival in an award-winning presentation a couple of years ago in 2019. And that I construe as a kind of revision of the Glass Menagerie. In the book, I compare it to what O'Neill does with his early comedy and later tragedy, in creating a kind of the obverse of one and the other. Long Day's Journey into Night is a version of the O'Neill family in a way that his earlier comic play wasn't. And I think that with Williams, if you read The Glass Menagerie together with A Lovely Sunday for Creve Coeur, you see that Williams has tempered his dislike for St. Louis and is really affectionate toward a character like Bodenheffer, who would have been savagely mocked in other kinds of plays, but is now treated with a kind of gentleness and warmth. So I think that Williams grew to accept St. Louis, and he grew to accept Washington University. He really did in his later years. That play is from the late 70s, and you can sense that maturation, or at least lack of anger, in his comments, public comments, in around 1976, 77. So yes, I think he did reconcile somewhat to what St. Louis was as he became older.
We have two more questions that I want to get to from the audience. One that I think might be a little bit more involved than the other, but let's do Maria's question first, which might have a concise answer, might not. But Henry, do you know if Williams ever knew of and read the Spanish poet and playwright Federico Garcia Lorca?
Yes.
Lorca was also gay, and his themes seem similar, which I did not know that Lorca was gay. So,
yeah,
my theater education.
Yes, and yes, we never stopped learning. I would say that Williams was strongly influenced by Lorca, and in fact, there's a wonderful one-act play written in verse form, in which called Resurrection, that Williams deliberately sets out to emulate Lorca. I think that they have a lot in common, especially the combination of the approach to lyricism on the stage, which, of course, in the words of Arthur Miller, his famous contemporary, said that Tennessee Williams brought poetry onto the American stage. And that poetry, of course, which is something that William J. Smith, his former classmate, noted, Williams was always a poet, first and foremost. And I think the same is obviously true of Garcia Lorca. So I think that, yes, there is an area of comparison that is, I think, worth exploring in more detail. I don't think that there has been very much written on the subject, but it should be. Yes.
All right, last question of the evening. And this is from Tom, how did the ethnic and racial diversity of St. Louis figure into Williams' writing?
Well, I think that's a really interesting question, too. I think that in some ways, it was there in terms of his Southern upbringing. Remember, his first 7 years were in the Deep South, and he continued to connect with that Southern upbringing in plays that were set in the Deep South, like, for example, Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. So the ethnic diversity is there. It's also there in his short fiction. One of his earliest stories, Big Black, deals with ethnicity and race in a story written while he was a student between 1929 and 1932 at the University of Missouri in Columbia. But in a broader sense, with diversity, it's there in Williams. For a number of years, was forced to work. He dropped out of the University of Missouri, Columbia, and forced to work at the International Shoe Company where his father worked. In other words, he was taken summarily out of college and forced to work for about 3 years downtown. And in those excursions downtown at the St. Louis riverfront during the Depression, he encountered a number of artists from all different walks of life. And he encountered a number of people. And if we look at the early plays that he wrote for the Mummers in that same period of the mid-1930s, he is alive with awareness of poverty. There's a play that is very seldom done called Fugitive Kind, which takes place in St. Louis, Missouri. And the backdrop, the astonishing thing is that he wrote the play in the summer, but it's set at Christmas time. And the backdrop for the play is St. Louis with the snow on the ground. And it set in a hotel, a boarding house, with characters and people from all different walks of life. So, and he himself is really also portrayed in that. There's a self-portrait there too, but there are characters of all different classes and economic strata, and those classes would not have been accessible to him had he simply stayed in the Deep South. They were there because he was working downtown in St. Louis on Washington Avenue at the International Shoe Company. So that his exposure to St. Louis, and in fact, one scholar, Tom Mitchell, I don't know if he's the originator of this question, has written a brilliant essay on the Mummers and St. Louis. So yes, Williams had a heightened awareness of the importance of diversity and ethnicity because of his St. Louis background, but also because of his Southern upbringing. So the two conspire really to give him a broader background than if he were just, say, from New York or some other place. I mean, he was able to really bring these different aspects together into an awareness. And his earliest exposure to the mummers and to other artists who were working in the WPA during the Depression years allowed him to understand poverty and people and to understand how people were on the dole in St. Louis. So that was an important part, particularly in his early years. So in saying that he had one subject merely autobiography, I wasn't quite correct. I mean, there is, and especially in the early plays, a very strong sense of social diversity that's going on. And it's important to realize that an early work like Candles to the Sun, which I mentioned, which was written in St. Louis as well, which is set in the Red Hills of Alabama, but it is still a play about rich and poor. It's largely a play about economic diversity, as well as plays like Fugitive Kind that I mentioned.
All right, well, we have gone over the hour, but I want to thank you both so much for this incredible conversation. As a kind of lifelong fan of Tennessee Williams, this has been a really interesting talk, a really informative talk. And Bob, I thank you as always. You are such a big supporter of Left Bank Books, and I'm so happy that you were able to do this conversation tonight. Henry, thank you for writing this book, for having this conversation, and for coming in to sign copies of the book. So we have signed copies available at left-bank.com, or you can email us if you are international. I included a link or a comment about how you can order internationally, and so happy to have your support and to be able to get this book into so many people's hands.
Thank you so much, both Shane and Robert.
Thank you.
Thanks for
Henry.
All right. And to the audience watching, thank you all so much for being here tonight. We hope to see you again really soon. Have a fantastic rest of your evening.
Enjoy. Thanks again.